It's supposed to be something special to the parents, to be given to their sons.
But now this tradition has been banned by the government.
When humanity first began to create art, when humanity first moved to create symbols, inherited meanings carried throughout time, would the body not become a canvas for these meanings, for its beautification, in the same way as a home? But tattooing, especially for the Westerner, has this taboo association. Next to every continent across the world had a tattooing tradition. To look across all the peoples, across all the cultures in the ancient world, and to notice that there is tattooing there. How did this come to be? How did this universal trope or motif become next to universal? But in that question of how also comes the why. Why did these various cultures go about tattooing traditions? And what have we lost in the way of understanding when it comes to this? But there's another big question here. Why it fell out of favor? Why the hegemony of the world seeked to repress tattooing culture? We're going to investigate these questions. And in that investigation, we're going to come to a macroscopic perspective on it. We're going to skip over many dignified traditions in order to do so. But this is an intention of opening up the field, of opening up the conversation, and to give an overarching perspective on the history of tattooing. So, where do we begin? In truth, there is no way to speak to the beginning in any meaningful sense. This aforementioned near ubiquitous quality of tattooing across the world implies a deep, deep prehistoric origin. However, when it comes to what we can say in the academic sphere, nearly 7,000 years ago, there were these clay figures in Japan that portrayed face painting or face tattooing. Otherwise, if we want more concrete evidence, then it's the Otzi Iceman, discovered in the Alps. Estimates date his body to be from around 3,300 BC. And this is the concrete evidence. An actual preserved body bearing 57 different tattoos. And this started a quest of academic intrigue. They noticed the tattoos correlated with different acupuncture points across the body. This was a speculation as to perhaps the reason tattoo culture began as a medicinal practice, to hypothesize that perhaps this individual suffered from arthritis or different conditions that would necessitate some intervention to alleviate. Earlier in the academic tradition, ethnologists had a hypothesis about scarification being the beginning of it all. Anthropological observations had them put two and two together and see how in Africa and in the Americas and over in Papua New Guinea, there were practices of rubbing scars with dirt or prescriptive plants in order to make scarification happen. And wearing your scars to be a point of pride or in a point of fierceness, to display to others your experiences, your identity, and this perhaps being the beginning of this tattooing trope. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We mentioned the discovery of Otzi, this preserved body or this mummy bearing tattoos. Naturally, we might think of Egypt's contribution to this. And throughout their history, it's been known for quite a long time how this tattooing practice was almost exclusively reserved for women. And in that, reserved for assistance, magically or medicinally, with pregnancy and childbearing. But these preserved bodies bearing tattoos extend all around the world. We can find them in the British Isles. We can find them in Peru, Siberia, Japan, China, Greece, Italy, Scandinavia, in the Americas, in Taiwan, across Polynesia, so forth. The dating of these discovered tattooed bodies are highly variable, but we should be mindful that dating tattoo culture based off of these discovered bodies, these mummies, is not informing us as to the deep history, the ultimate inheritance of this religious medicinal motif. We can only tease at it via these archaeological discoveries. We can begin to narrow the conversation by looking to the Americas, then we'll quickly observe how widespread it was. Amidst the Iroquois, amidst the Navajo, the Cherokee, the Lakota, the Sioux, tattooing was fairly popular among the variant tribes of the Northwest, extending all the way to the First Nations and Alaska. And then down in South America, of course, the Mayans and the Aztecs, along with several other indigenous groups, all the way down into the southern tip of Chile. But in the Gran Chaco people, we're going to observe this line that we established earlier with the Egyptian customs around tattooing. Now, the Gran Chaco people, along with many across the world, as we'll see, had this belief that the openings of the body were of particular vulnerability to supernatural subterfuge. Bad spirits whisper into your ears, or enter through your nose, or you see the evil eye and it curses you. These are different means for bad spirits to enter you. And in accordance, the woman having a inherently more yin attribution is even more susceptible to these forces. This is the belief. This danger was thought to be exponentiated by puberty. And we can make this mundane by pointing out that when a woman comes of age, there are dangers of the world presented to her that she didn't have to face prior to reaching that menstruation. Ill-mannered characters or ill-mannered spirits would seek to take advantage of this power, this inherent power that the woman gains, this power of creation, of beauty, and of attraction. We should point out that this trope survives, interestingly, into the modern age. If you even look at exorcism movies, who is always being possessed? It is a woman, a young woman who is being possessed by these spirits. Intriguing, right? This is the explanation behind the tattooing culture here. It's not to say that men would never have tattoos, but it's to say that women were abundantly more tattooed. Women would get their first tattoo around the age of 7, and each year ensuing, other additions to this tattoo would be added. Lines, circles, half moons, so forth, generally geometric forms. Then, once full maturity had been reached and she was eligible for marriage, the tattoos would stop. We see something very similar with the indigenous Japanese, the Ainu. Beginning with menstruation, women would get a tattoo around their lips each year that they would go unmarried thereafter. Once again, once they'd get married, the tattooing would cease. Looking back to the Americas and up to the First Nations, and perhaps one of the most recognizable cultures that practices ancestral tattooing, the Inuit peoples. Very curious evidence for the history of this practice has been found on St. Lawrence Island outside of Alaska, And over in Greenland as well, this particular practice of female facial tattooing. Now, these peoples are many, so there is variability, especially where the tattoos are placed and the patterning. But nonetheless, we see that commonality that we've been establishing, where the first menstrual cycle coincides with the first tattoo. That this is what it means to become a woman and to enter that part of the life cycle. This could be so serious to the point that you would not be allowed to enter the afterlife or the spirit world post-death if you were not bearing your tattoos. This helps to establish a different sort of modality that we'll see across the world in regards to tattooing traditions, and that is the ancestry of a people, or the inheritance of self through the ancestry of people, and how the mark or tattooing is a sort of pact with your lineage. This is a great introduction to discussing the Maori of New Zealand. Now, Polynesia is an absolute boon when it comes to discussing our given subject in this session. But I first want to point out that in Maori tattooing, women get the same sort of tattoo as the women in the Inuit tradition. This mutuality of this chin tattoo, a very similar style, brings greater questions, very considerable questions to bear. Could we perhaps look across the world and find likened tattooing traditions and use that as an indicator of prehistorical contact between peoples? We'll bring this up later. Tamoko, or the tradition of tattooing for the Maori people, is ancestral, familial, and a designation of status. Traditionally, women had the chin tattoo and the lips, and men would have a full face tattoo and or a trouser tattoo. And this is where we can introduce this conversation as well. Where you get this tattoo, traditionally based off of ancestry, is variable based off of what tradition, what country. And this trouser tattoo is evocative of the greater Austronesian cultural style. This extends outward to Southeast Asia as well, this particular placement of the tattooing on males. This migration is a curious thing to contemplate, how Southeast Asia bears these styles similar to those that would spread throughout Polynesia, and how these variant peoples and variant histories may have spoken to each other, and where they all inherit their cultural tattooing traditions from. With the Maori, though, there is a story that speaks of where the tradition of Tamoko comes from. It is said that it was taught from peoples who came from the underworld, who had pale skin as though it would glow in the dark, who had blonde hair, who had piercing blue eyes. This account, this history, this folk wisdom inherited gives a few different interpretations readily. One, it points to this more supernatural quality, again, coming from the underworld, how these peoples would visit around 3 a.m. out of curiosity from the other world. But on the other hand, we could speculate that perhaps this inheritance of Tamoko, of the tradition of tattooing, is coming from a pre-contact with peoples that were very other to this area. The oral tradition here with the Maori is extra telling in another explanation behind this history in this session that we're going through here, and that is the relationship with pain. What do I mean? In an age much more preoccupied with superficiality, with uncertainty avoidance, and with creature comforts at every wake and turn, every placation of the subconscious possible, it's a bit foreign for us to consider the utility of pain in a way that isn't masochistic or strange or sadistic, but instead the use of pain as an affirmation or as a tool of growth. This helps us to unpack the rite of passage, this promise to your future self, or this promise that you put down into your own skin of your own loyalty to a cause or to a value or belief. This pain that you continuously sign yourself up for, that you are grateful to receive in order to bring a kinship, not just with those that are immediately with you and those that you belong with, but also a connection to your ancestors, your lineage, that of which you came to be from. So this is a very different utility for pain than the modern Western mind is used to comprehending. This loyalty, this devotedness, this mark upon yourself to show, to endure, and to continuously display to yourselves and others what you are made of and what you are crafted from. I hope this adequately demonstrates this sense of becoming, this sense of initiation that we've been seeing throughout this session so far already. And I just want to point out a quick refresher here. We've already seen substantial variance as to why. We've seen a more magical explanation. We've seen it as it's been more engendered, specifically more towards this is an exclusively female practice. And already with the Maori, we see that the more heavily tattooed ones are the males. So this gives way to variance, and also, as already mentioned, where the tattooing is. With the Maori in particular, there are the traditional placements, but they do vary depending on choice or familial lineage. If we look north to the Philippines, then we'll see that next to every ethnic group living pre-contact had tattoos, some much more seriously than others. Amongst them, there were words for those that didn't have any tattoos. And this would be likened to the word naked or uninitiated or young. You see, the way of interpreting those without as naked, unmarked, or plain, like a canvas without a mark, without a stroke on it. Those that give the tattoos, the quote tattoo artists, are highly praised cultural figures. What they bring is uniquely sacred, and the tool used for tattooing is the same as it is throughout Polynesia. When the Magellan expedition made contact, they called them Los Pintados, which means the painted ones. And this will come up again later. But I want to pay some attention to the designs because we haven't talked about that much yet in this session. The designs here are totemistic, so animals, putting animals directly on oneself, or plants, so ferns, flowers, so forth, or astrological or geometric forms. This choice of geometric forms extends up into Asia as well, into the yantra tattooing tradition. This grouping or this overall style isn't just the Philippines, it's Indonesia, it's Myanmar, it's India, it's Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, so on. This sacred geometry is curious because we might see this and think, oh, this is Buddhism, or this is a deep cut into Jainism, when in fact, perhaps this geometric form that we think is so evocative of these faiths is actually coming from the tribal animism that predates these things in this greater area. So an earnest question here is, how long have the peoples of this geographical area of the earth been getting these forms tattooed on themselves? It's also interesting to note that Buddhism hasn't made this act taboo. The point should be made crystal clear that there is no inherent disagreement between religion and tattooing. But we'll be getting into that later, why that is an assumption of ours. This is just to say that these forms often are accompanied by phrases. Overall, yantra tattoos are believed to be that kind of magical or amulet or good luck charm sort of appeal. As an example, why does a Christian wear a cross? Is this a sigil of protection for them? Is this a good luck charm? Is this a reminder of who they are, an affirmation of sorts? This same sort of appeal can be seen here. Why someone in this long withstanding tradition of Southeast Asia would put a mandala or a mantra on themselves as a bolster of some sort of charm or magical property. There's a lot more to be discussed in Asia. For instance, the very complex story of tattooing in regards to the history of Japan or the Kurdish people's history of tattooing. But I really want to talk about Europe in regards to this. For instance, what is the etymology of Britain? Well, if you take it back to its original reference in the Greek, it means the tattooed folk, or the painted ones, or the island of tattooed people. But this is a relatively rare case that we can 100% confirm that these peoples had a tattooing tradition. Because in regards to European history, this is a lot more convoluted and complex because of the obfuscation of history. We can 100% confirm that those on Britain were heavily tattooed. The Thracians also had a practice of tattooing that was exclusive to men and was prized among men and was a sign of punishment for women if they had it at all. There's also the case of the Scythians coming from the greater shrub steppe of Central Asia. They most certainly had an intricate history of tattoos, and the degree of sophistication in their tattoos is an anomalous mark on history. How it came to be so precise, how they managed to interweave in the intricacy and colorations that they did, is something that is still not yet discernible. But historically, we might first think of the Vikings bearing these runic tattoos, when in fact this is academically contested. What is certain is the practice of tooth filing, and this can be found across Africa and into Southeast Asia as well. What is overall more favorable, or what can be more readily discerned through historical accounts and through archaeological finds, is the presence of tattooing in the Celtic or the greater Celtic people. There is still debate here, but nonetheless, the Pictish people in the reports given display tattoos that resemble tamoko for the Maori. And if you look into these different illustrations, you might see a resemblance there. Anyway, we don't know the truth behind Celtic tattooing in the sense of the reports say the tattoos are blue and they were made of woad. But the truth is that woad is not a good plant substance to make tattoo ink with. This has never been recreated. These blue tattoos were all pervasive, all across the bodies. Something lost to time is the significance behind these symbols worn throughout these greater peoples. What druidic meanings, perhaps? What did this iconography signify? The greater assumption about European ancestral tattooing was that it was more inclined towards a warrior display. The pain of enduring tattoos was an initiation into how much pain one could take on the field of battle. the symbolism and the totemistic animals put on the body would be to exalt one's own power, to further it, to embrace that totemistic amplification, but also, quite simply, to intimidate. And this would have been done, certainly. It did intimidate those that they fought with substantially. But this is a case of it fits the bill because it corroborates with the accounts that we receive from the Romans on their behalf, you see. This is all secondhand, and that's why this has overall been a questionable investigation, historically speaking. The facts are is that we know there was tattooing in greater or lesser degrees in the European continent pre-Romanization. We don't know why. We don't know what they were made of. We don't know what they signified. We don't know where that ancestry would be inherited from. We just know that it was there. And that obviously now it's been lost. So let's talk about how and why this got lost. Because it's not just Europe that is going to get its history dissolved, its history supplanted in this regard. So now we have to begin the story of why the Western world believes tattooing is taboo. And in truth, the answer is the Greeks. You can point to Rome, you can point to Christianity, but really it all came from a Greek disposition. The Greeks were historically unmarked when it came to their forming civilization. They learned tattooing from the Persians, but they exclusively reserved this practice for branding people. This way, they could distinguish criminals and slaves, and that way, if they ran away, they could be identified and brought back. But before this even, the Greeks are reacting to their neighbors. Their neighbors are tattooed, and they view their neighbors as barbarous. So accordingly, tattoo is for the lower class, or those that are viewed to be lesser than us. And this word, dermatostixia, is the root of the term stigma. This was the word to designate dermas, skin, stixia, mark, the marking of the skin. So stigma, as we've inherited the word, is very telling in regards to classism, in regards to hierarchy, why some people have more than others, why some people are more sophisticated than others. This boils down to morals, the moral constitution of a person. This was the belief. And so those that have the mark are marked by lesser or ill moral temperament. It's worth pointing out as well that the ancient Chinese believed this in a similar way. Those that bared the mark were lesser class, or slaves, or criminals. Here, if you were to commit a particularly heinous or offensive crime, you would be branded on the face, and that way you're carrying that for the rest of your days. This would be a life sentence. Interestingly, Confucius puts forward this argument that the body is a gift from the parent, and so to mutilate the body is an insult to one's ancestry and their parents. It's funny that this argument can still be heard to this day, all this time later, how it's culturally moved this far ahead. Culturally, you can see that there's quite the distinction here. If everybody around us in varying degrees practices tattooing culture, then we can distinguish ourselves by not having any tattoo culture. And if we distinguish ourselves from them and we view ourselves to be better than them and we end up being the victors of that era of history, then this is what that future would look like. So while there is ubiquity across the ancient world that is yay to this, we do have two instances here of cultures that are very much against this. But if you go to any of these aforementioned cultures, or the many cultures that haven't been mentioned in this session, and you ask how this came to be suppressed and how this tattooing ancestral tradition got severed, then it is about missionaries. It is about proselytization. It is about Islamification and Christianization. It's the imported religions that came to supplant the indigenous traditions that they conquered. But if you earnestly look into the Quran and if you earnestly look into Christian scripture, you'll see that this isn't as clear as you might assume. For instance, the Quran doesn't mention tattooing. The Quran does admonish those who change the creation of Allah, but you have to kind of squint a bit to make that about tattooing. There's another argument that says that the tattoo blocks one from taking in the water sacrament, and therefore it is haram. But this seems much more readily interpretable as political or a cultural difference than it is a religious difference. It's very obvious when you put it out plainly like this. Tattoos are associated with indigenous pagan traditions. We, as people of the Abrahamic faith, do not want that in any way. So thus, the things that are associated with those traditions ought to be made forbidden. When it comes to Christianity, though, we have to go to Leviticus. And of course we have to go to Leviticus, because if anybody knows their Bible, then if you want some firepower on somebody, you're sure to find it in Leviticus. Whether you actually practice everything in Leviticus or not. But anyway, the quote is from 1928. "You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves." Now this seems very plain spoken, straightforward. It even mentions tattoo. However, this is a modern translation. This culture that wrote this material wouldn't have had the word for tattooing. There was a term for marking, and this would be much more accurately interpreted as scarification. The quote makes that clear as well. So it doesn't want ritualistic scarification, because in ancient Canaan, there is evidence to say that there was ritualistic self-mutilation. So it's really not a hot take to say that the Bible, in fact, is just condemning scarification, which again brings back this subject of how a culture interprets the utility of pain. The Canaanites would take to ritualistic self-mutilation in order to grieve and mourn the loss of gods or the loss of loved ones. This was to show, to display your sincerity, to welcome pain, to show your devotion to something. But that's not the problem here. The problem that's being made is a cultural difference, a cultural distinction. And who wins the day? Well, whose book are we reacting to right now? So the Greeks turned Christian, and they speak to each other in this way, culturally. The books of the Abrahamic religion speak already to the Greek cultural basis. Christianity begins its institutionalization. Constantine bans facial tattoos in 330 AD. This seemed like a sympathetic move, though, because, again, tattooing in this part of the world was exclusively done to criminals and to slaves. So this was merciful. He was just simply saying tattoos should only be on the hands or on the calves instead. But then by the time we get to the Second Council of Nicaea in the late 700s, then all tattoos are banned because they are associated with pagan practices. So there it is, stated very clearly. Our cultural ways don't dignify that practice. Our culturally sanctioned ways to approach divinity do not allow for that way of approaching ancestry and culture. There is another notable exception here, though, and that is the Crusades. Tattooing re-emerged in an overall marginal way among the soldiers of the Crusades. Christians would tattoo the cross on themselves in order to be distinguished on the battlefield in need of a certain burial rite. This will come up later. Soldiers getting tattoos. In spite of this, regardless, more poignantly speaking, importing religion is importing culture, and Christianization tells the rest of this story by where it spreads. And the vehemence and the expanse of its spread is why by the time the 1700s comes around, this is an almost completely taboo, unknown, foreign thing to the common people. They have been severed from their ancestral lineage in this way. And so there needs to be a reintroduction of the term tattoo when specifically sailors are going about the world and making trades. This early encroachment of globalism reintroduces tattooing in this way through sailors, because as a practice, if you visit a culture, that culture knows that you're one of them if you bear their mark. This was especially pertinent in the greater Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, and the islands of Austronesia. To go to a different island, to get that tattoo, would be a sort of way of readmittance back onto that island. You bear our mark. And so, in a way, it wasn't just a cultural custom and a cultural courtesy to receive that mark from the culture of which you were visiting, but also in the way of belonging. So sailors started to come back with these tattoos. And there's the word I've been using over and over, tattoo. Tattoo was taken from Samoa and from Tahiti. That word is loaned into our language. And that shows this divorce that was formed from this cultural motif. This loan term enters English vernacular in the 1700s. But still yet this stigma holds true. Yes, sailors have them, but sailors are thought to be on the lesser part of the social ladder. So if that's the case, who do sailors hang out with? Probably other low-rung blue-collar types. So all of a sudden, miners start having tattoos, wearing the iconography of the mine as a sort of safety emblem. As an instance, this is when the first permanent tattoo shops are starting to be set up in the United States. And they will become much more popular by virtue of the Civil War. The trope of Navy men, aforementioned, and soldiers now getting tattoos for purposes of identification on the field of battle. Yet again, the cross is being tattooed on them quite commonly, but now also family insignia, the names of loved ones. So curiously, tattooing reintroduces itself to the culture by means of its most dangerous professions. This warrior attribution, previously mentioned as a potential explanation for tattooing culture, is what is re-emerging the conversation, reintroducing it into the public psyche. There are a number of developments here, but be summative and say that there are a number of depictions that help popularize the conversation point of tattoos. The leaps in technology help this mass production of tattoos. But this growing availability is being made in the direction of people that have lost their ancestral tie to this tattooing culture. Regardless of what peoples they came from, they don't have access to that lineage, to that tradition that they lost. Or perhaps they came from peoples who never had a tradition, to be fair. But regardless, tattooing had an uphill battle throughout this last century to fight. Usually those that would gravitate towards doing so were those that were comfortable going in the face of orthodoxy. So it normally was associative with anti-establishment movements or unsavory characters. This assumption of lower class still stained the image. And this is roughly where we are. Except now there is a cultural divide, a generational divide. Only 16% of those older than 55 have a tattoo. Whereas those between 18 to 35 have a almost 47% chance of having a tattoo. Now, these numbers have been debated, but the point, I think, is readily apparent to anybody living in this day and age, that this conversation has been shifting in our lifetime. Those who are older generally have the same kind of cultural reaction to tattoos, and those that are younger have a culturally different reaction. This, to me, is very curious. As the strong arm of Christianity waned in the West, and as it has been waning in its hegemony, then tattoo culture has been re-emerging in its place in the same way as alternative faiths have, whether neo-pagan or neo-Gnostic, so on. But it doesn't even have to be that extreme, because this is ancestral. The cultural taboos were imported. Many of us that have throughout generations spoke against this cultural tradition were coming from people who held this tradition and who had it severed from their lineage and who were made to completely forget that lineage and that tradition. There has been so much of this lost to time, suppressed by cultural indoctrination, by Indian schools, by violence and forced assimilations. In truth, this is not ethnic. Our collective ancestral history shows that regardless of ethnicity, tattooing was a part of our history, and much of it was lost to this cultural assimilation. And we're seeing, I believe, this next generation and ensuing generations moving to re-embrace this, even if it's not in a very straightforward fashion. I believe in time, this classism taboo that's been pushed on this subject for so long will flip. And I believe what we're doing in this generation and those ensuing, whether consciously or unconsciously, are bringing this back through Renaissance. And it will be reinvented, and it will be rediscovered, and it will be re-embraced. But let's do some distillations and some review before we close this. Modern tattooing at large seems to be more preoccupied with beautification. And that's not to say that it wasn't a part of the appeal in the ancient world. But in the ancient world, there was more room given to symbolism, an inherited cultural meaning coming along with the iconography or sigils put on the skin. As we've seen, this was a part of the reasoning behind tattooing in the ancient world. The magical or sacred emanation coming from that. In the very beginning, we saw its medicinal or potential medicinal use in acupuncture. Then there are marks that provide protection. And again, I want to point out, for the same reason that somebody would wear a cross, you have sigils of protection put on you. The only difference is cultural taboos. Something else generally lost to modern tattooing is this promise to the future, or this dedication to something by the tattoo. This as a pact, this as a agreement with the world, with the higher power, or with your collective ancestors. Something that has traveled throughout time, both in ancient and modern tattooing practices, is identification, for better and for worse. The mark of an individual, your individual life, and what you prize uniquely unto yourself. That experience that you shared with other peoples, or that affirmation that you wanted to instill unto yourself. This can be practical, this can be artistic, this can be spiritual, but regardless of all this, I find it curious to take notice the trends. while it was very culturally variable throughout this whole study, there was and is something to be said about a female predisposition towards tattoos. There is something deeply instinctual for us there. There is something in men that prizes their scars, that prizes when they have survived something that they might not have thought that they could. This triumph over the circumstances of life. There is something instinctual there. Personally, I always find it curious to notice what animals people choose to tattoo on themselves. Is it engendered somehow? Is it ancestral? Is it instinctual? This choice that comes about. So in truth, in indirect and subliminal and very curious ways, the history of tattooing not only leads to great mysteries about prehistory, but also leads to great mysteries about what we've done with the markings of our own bodies.
Presumably offend some people or excite an awful lot of unnecessary curiosity.
The Spiritual Studies course is a project, an aspiration, an initiative towards offering free public education on matters of religion, spirituality, and comparative mythology. It aims to offer this uniquely in a sober and earnest fashion. If you benefited from this education, if you feel like this sort of information, this approach benefits the world, then consider helping it to continue, consider helping to make it go further. Look to the Buy Me Coffee link in the description box below. Those that support the course on a regular basis receive names at the end of the video. They receive special commentaries, updates on each of the sessions to come. More information and more benefits to come as the course continues to grow in its archive and what it gives to the world. Also, if that's too much commitment, you could just buy me a coffee. That way I can buy a book for research, something that helps out in the future, some solidarity. But if you benefited from this particular session, it's because people stepped forward to help it. And that is Maggie, Slow Leak, John Crestwell, Deborah Cano, the Satyr Witch, Kristen, Nora, the Irrational Sage, Scorson, Craig Mitchell, and quote, someone. Stay curious. Keep wondering.